Hello and welcome to a brand new video. In this video, I am going to teach you how to use Room database in your Android application to save all the important user data into a proper database table in your Android application. So when you're building Android application, you need to save the important user data into a specific database. The user data can be anything such as email ID, phone number, contact list of user, or follower or friend list of user, etc. etc. And all that data needs to be saved in a properly secure place and in a proper format. And that is why we use Room database to save all the important user data in a proper table format in your local storage of your Android application. In this video, I will show you start to the end process of how to add Room database in your own Android application. And by the end of this video, you will learn everything about Room database, and you can create your own database. You can edit, write, delete, and perform all the CRUD operation. CRUD means create, read, update and delete operation in your Room database. So with that said, let's get started with our video. So let's try to understand what exactly is the Room database library. So in Android, if you want to save any data, we typically save it in a SQLite database. And the Room database library is like a wrapper around SQLite database to save the data. The Room database library provides an abstract layer over SQLite. So whenever we use a Room database, we are basically using SQLite under the hood. So RoomDB has three important parts. First is the entity, second is DAO, which means a data access object, and third is the database. So what is entity? Entity is like a table in itself. Entity file will represent a table, and we will add all the name of the columns inside the entity file. Second is the data access object. Data access object will contain all the SQL queries. The SQL queries and those functions of the query will be important for us to interact with the RoomDB. Third is the database, which will contain all the important information, and basically this is the entry point of our application, and this will also store the instance of our RoomDB. So let's jump into the code and understand how to implement RoomDB in your own application. So step number 1 is first you need to add the Room database library in your Android Gradle project. So as shown here, first we have to add the plugin in your build.gradle file of your application module, and then add all the important dependencies. So here inside this demo application project which I have created, inside the app module, open the app Gradle module, and inside the app Gradle module, as you can see, I have added the important plugins which is Android KSP. In the dependency section, I have added all the important RoomDB libraries inside this, and this is the build.gradle file in our app module. This is important. You have to add libraries in your app module of your Gradle file. After adding Room database libraries, you have to perform the Gradle sync. And after Gradle sync, now let's move on to the next step. Now next step is let's create an entity file. So what is an entity file? Entity file is basically a simple representation of a table. In RoomDB, we save all the information in a tabular format or a table format, just like SQLite. So how to create an entity file? First create a simple Kotlin file named flower, and then create a data class. So what we are doing here is I have created a simple flower file, and inside this flower.kt file I have created an entity named flower. So basically we are creating a flower database to save all the information of a flower into our DB. And the method to create an entity is first we create a class, make it a data class, and then add the annotation at entity. Whenever we add the at entity annotation, this represents that this flower class will belongs to the RoomDB entity, and this entire flower class is a table which belongs to the RoomDB. So then that is how we this is how we create a class with an entity annotation. The next step is first we need to declare the schema or the name of the column. So the ID, name, color are basically the name of the column, and the ID needs to be unique. This is very important. Each and every entity or each and every table in a RoomDB has a unique ID column, and the unique ID column needs to have a unique value which should be absolutely unique in entire DB. So here I have used at primary annotation to make this as a primary key, and inside the bracket I have added auto generate is equal to true. This means that whenever a new data entry is created, the ID will automatically created, and it will be a very unique ID in the DB. And the next is the name of the flower and the color of the flower, which will be in a string format, and it will be saved as a string format. In RoomDB, you can save value in any format such as integer, string, float, etc. etc. but here I have stored it in a string format. So this is how we create a entity file. This is a flower entity, which means this is a table which will contain all the information of flower, name, color, and the unique ID of the flower. You can create multiple data table in RoomDB, but for the simplicity, I have created only the one flower DB table, which is the entity file. After creating entity, the next step is to create data access object. Now on the left corner, as you can see, I have created a flower DAO. Flower DAO is basically a flower data access object. Purpose of this is to interact with our database, and we will add all the important queries such as create, read, update, write, delete into our data access object. That is the purpose of the data access object. Data access object will store all the queries and functions which can be used to interact with our flower database. So how to create data access object? We need to create an interface which is flower DAO, and then add the annotation at DAO. This annotation is important because this annotation will tell the room library that this flower DAO interface belongs to the data access object of our room library. And this is how we create a simple interface of a data access object. Now next is, let's understand how to perform create, update, read and delete queries inside our DAO, data access object. First, let's understand how to create a data entry into our table. So here is how to add the new flower entry into our database. Create a suspended function insert flower, and then add the input parameter which is a flower entity, and then at the top of the function add the @insert annotation. This @insert annotation will tell the room library that this function insert flower will add the flower into our database. So this is how we write any query in our data access object. Create a function, and then on top of the function add the annotation, and annotation will add the query. So when we call this function insert flower and add the flower inside this, we can add our flower into the database. After adding flower into DB, the next is, let's understand how to read all the files from the DB and display it to the user. So this function getAllFlowers will fetch all the flowers from our room database and then return as a list format. And on top of this function, we will add the query. So this query is a SQL query, select star from a flower. In RoomDB, you can use any SQL query to interact with your database. And to use any query, just simply add query annotation and then mention the query which you want to use. So this is how we read flower from our database. But in case if you want to read only one single file, then you can use this query. Create a function getFlower by ID and then mention the ID of the flower which is an integer, and then on top add the annotation @query select star from flower where ID is equal to whatever ID which you mention here. So whichever ID you mention here will be added into this query, and this query will be run, and then the flower from the database will be returned as a variable. So this query will select an individual flower from the database and then give it back to the user as a variable. Now let's imagine that if you want to update a specific entry in your table, which is a flower entry. Like for example, if you mistaken spelling of a flower name, then you have to update that specific flower name in your database. So this is how we update a very specific entry in our flower table. First we create a function update flower and mention the flower and mention the annotation @update. This is the most simplest way to update any specific row or a specific entity inside our table. So this is another alternative to update flower, where you can select flower based on its ID and manually edit its name and color of the flower. So both the methods are good. You can use any method whichever you want based on your requirements. Now next is, imagine if you want to delete a specific flower from your database, then you can use this following query. You can use the SQL query to delete a specific flower depending on its ID of the flower. Create a simple function delete flower by ID, mention the ID and then pass this ID into the query which is our SQL query, and add the delete from flower where ID is equal to whichever ID which you have mentioned here. This is how we delete the flower based on its ID. Another simple method to delete entire flower is simply add the add delete annotation and then mention the flower which you want to delete. Both the ways are perfect way. You can use any one of these depending on your needs and requirements. Now let's move on to the next part, which is create a flower database. So this is how we create flower database. On the left side, create a file named flower database. Inside this file, create an abstract class named flower database and then add the constructor room database. And this is how we create an abstract class which will represent a room database. And on top, add the annotation database, and inside this add entities. We have only one single entity, which is a flower entity. Mention the flower entity. If you have multiple entities, you can mention multiple entities here, but since as of now we have only one entity, so I have mentioned flower class here. Next is you have to add the version of the RoomDB and add export schema is equal to false, which is optional. You can also add it true in case if you want to export it. Now inside this abstract class, first we have to declare our flower DAO, which means flower data access object, and add it a function which is an abstract function. Now here given below, I have created a singleton pattern of a class, because reason why I have used singleton is so that the RoomDB will only have one single instance in our entire application. This is a good practice to create a one single instance of the RoomDB. This will prevent any error of multiple instance or duplication of instance. So that's why I have created a singleton class to create a RoomDB. So to instantiate a RoomDB, first create an instantiate variable and add room.database builder. Inside this add the application context, add flower database class, and then mention the name of our DB, which is flower_DB, and then write .build. This will create a RoomDB instance, and then we can use this instance in our main application activity to create, modify, edit or update anything in our database. I have made this everything singleton, which is a good practice in Android programming. I will also recommend you to use only singleton to instantiate the database of your RoomDB. Now next step is we have to initialize our database at the entry point of our application. You can initialize wherever you want, but generally it is a good practice to initialize it as the onCreate function of our main activity. So this is how we initialize the flower database in our onCreate function of our main activity. Write flower database dot get database and add the application context, which is this, and this variable DB we will use this to read, write, update or delete anything from our database. Now let me show you one by one how to perform CRUD operation, which is create, read, update and delete in our room database. Now first is the create operation. So how to create a flower in our RoomDB? First we initialize the flower DB and we will get a DB variable, and then we will use that DB variable to get the flower DAO, which means data access object of our flower, which is this file of our flower. Once we get our flower data access object, we can use it to create, read, update or delete or perform any operation or execute any query on our DB table. Now here I have made a simple Jetpack Compose application which will take the flower name, flower color from user input and then add it into our table. So when we click the add button, this is how we simply add the flower into our table. First we will create the flower entity and then add the name of the flower and color of the flower into that flower entity variable, which is flower, and then we will use our flower DAO, which means flower data access object, and call the function insert flower and add the flower into it. Now this insert flower is the same function which we have created in a data access object, which is insert flower. We are simply calling these functions from our data access object, and then we will adding the flower into it, and this will save the flower into our database table. This entire operation of adding new flower into the database needs to be run on a separate Kotlin Coroutine thread. So whenever we use any data access object or perform any queries on the database, we need to do it on a separate thread instead of main application thread. Hence we are using scope.launch, which is a coroutine, and then add our entire database operation inside the coroutine. We will add all the database operation inside a coroutine because coroutine is important to perform asynchronous task, and each and every task which we perform on the database is asynchronous. Hence we use coroutine, and also it is important for the performance that we need to execute any database related query on a separate thread, which is a coroutine thread. Now let's debug the application and let me show you how to add flower into database. So on the right side, this is our application. So on the right side, I have debugged the application. There are 4 buttons. First button will add the flower. Second button will view all the flowers in our database. Third is to edit, and then last one is to delete. So this code to create a flower, we will click on first button. So let's add the name of the flower, which is a rose, and then color red, and then we will click on the save button. As soon as I click on this button, the flower name and the color is saved in a database and a new flower is created. So this code is executed as soon as I click this save button. And this is how we create a new flower in our database. Now after adding flower into our database, next is let's understand how to use app inspect function of our Android Studio. Let's view this entire table using our Android Studio. In Android Studio, there is a function known as app inspection. On the left corner of Android Studio, there is an icon named app inspection. Click on this icon, and then if you're running application in a debug mode, the flower DB will appear here. Now this database inspector is very important because this will give you insight into your RoomDB and tell you everything about RoomDB. So if you click on the flower table, as you can see, the entire flower table is open up, and we can see the entry. First is a rose entry, color is the red. And we can see the name of the column, ID, name, and the color. This is a room table which we have created using the flower entity. And using app inspection to view into entire RoomDB is very handful and very useful while debugging the larger application. Now next is let me show you how to get all the flowers from our database and show it in a list format in our application. On the right side, this is our application. There is second button, view all entries. If I click on this button will show all the flower entries from our RoomDB table and show it in a list format. Now to get all the flowers from our table, you have to use the get all flower functions using our flower data access object. Let me show you the code. Here I have used Jetpack Compose, and this line value flowers by flower DAO dot get flowers dot collect as a state. Now this collect as state is important because this will get all the flowers from our database, and it will save it in a flowers in a real time, which means whenever we update any room table or update any flower or delete any flower, the update will be instantly collected and save it inside our flower variable. So this is how we get all the flowers from RoomDB in a list format. Now this get all flowers is the same function which we have used in a data access object class interface. This is the get all flower function which we use to get all the flowers from our DB and save it in a list format. The flowers variable is basically in list format, as you can see. And then this flower variable is pass on to the flower list, and then the flower list is shown as a list format in our display in our device. The concept is almost same. We will initialize database and then get flower DEO data access object, and then use get all flower functions from our data access object, and then store it in a list format in flowers, and then we will display it on a device. Now next is let's understand how to update a specific value of flower. So when we create a database table, sometimes we need to update a value inside that table because sometimes we make spelling mistake or something like that. So now let me show you a simple example of how to update a specific flower and change its color name. So for example, here rose is a red color. Now what if I want to update the color and instead of red I want to add it deep red. Now to edit the color, we will go back to our application home screen, and there is third button named edit. So to update a specific flower which is a rose flower, I have added the unique ID of the flower which is 1, and you can check the unique ID of the flower from our app inspection window. As you can see, the rose flower has a unique ID 1, so I will use the 1 as a unique ID here. And then next is the name which is rose, and then third is the color. The color I want to change from red to deep red. So I will write the deep red color here. Now I will click on the update button, and after clicking on the update button, the flower entry is updated. You can check it from the app inspection. Click on the refresh button, and then as you can see, the flower name is rose and the color is the deep red. Now how to perform this operation? It is very simple. Let me show you the code. Now to update the flower, here is the code. I have used the flower entity, added the ID of the flower, add the name of the flower and the new color of the flower inside this, and then save all of this into updated flower variable. This flower variable is the same as the flower entity which we have created previously, and then use the flower DAO, which is data access object, and call the function update flower. Now this update flower is the same function which we have used in data access object. This function is called here, and then the updated flower is added into this. So this is how we update the flower. And yes, most importantly, run this operation inside a coroutine. if you run any database operation on main thread of your application, the application will crash. That's why use Kotlin Coroutine to perform any database operation. So this is how we update the database. Now let's move on to the last part, which is how to delete a flower from our database table. So here I have created a rose name flower and jasmine name flower. Now what if I want to delete this rose name flower? Now to delete this flower, we will delete based on the ID of the flower. So we will take this unique ID, which is one number of a rose flower, and we will use that ID to delete that flower. The code to delete is very simple. Just like previously, we will use flower data access and call the delete flower by ID function. Now this delete flower by ID function will take the ID and delete flower based on the ID. So we will run this simple database operation inside the core routine just like previously, and let me show you an example. On the right corner, as you can see inside the app, I have added the flower unique ID, which is one number, and as soon as I click on the delete button, the flower will be erased from our table. As you can see inside this app inspection, if I refresh the table, as you can see the rose flower has disappeared from our database table. So this is how we delete a specific entry or specific flower from our database table. So this is how we perform CRUD operations on our room database table. CRUD means create, read, update and delete. RoomDB library is very simple to use in Android. You can create as many tables as you want, and you can create multiple tables in our RoomDB. The most important is whenever you perform any database operation, make sure you use Kotlin Coroutine and perform any database operation on a separate thread instead of main UI thread. Otherwise your application will get slowed down. So that's it for today. If you enjoy watching this and get value out of this, make sure you like, share and subscribe. And with that said, have a nice day and bye bye. See you in the next video.